Welcome to Phoenix Medical Lectures. In today's video, we'll be seeing about homeostasis, a very important topic in physiology. So to understand homeostasis, we'll look at an example. There is an increase in the glucose levels. In order to bring down the glucose level, insulin is activated. So when there is an increase in the glucose levels in the body, the insulin is activated, which brings down the glucose levels. So again, another example would be an increase in the blood pressure. In order to bring down the blood pressure, baroreceptors are activated, which brings down the blood pressure. So the balance is maintained. So this is known as homeostasis. In order to understand homeostasis better, we need to know about control systems. Okay, control systems, because there are three types of control systems, and this is how homeostasis is achieved by either one of the control systems. So the first one is negative feedback. The second one is positive feedback. And the third one is feed forward control. So there are three control systems: negative feedback, positive feedback, and feed forward control. So we'll be seeing one by one. The first one is negative feedback. Okay, the first one we're going to see is negative feedback, and we'll take an example. There is an increase in blood pressure, so our body needs to lower the blood pressure. So what all do we need? First, for a negative feedback to take place, stimulus. Here it is the blood pressure. Okay, there is an increase in the blood pressure, that is the stimulus here. So coming to the second one, we need sensors or receptors. Here it would be the baroreceptors. Okay, we've got sensors as receptors. Here we have baroreceptors. Third, we need effectors, on which here in this example it would be the medulla. Okay, so all this together would lower the blood pressure. So when there's an increase in BP, which is the stimulus, receptors are activated, in this case baroreceptors, and then we have effectors. Here we have the medulla on which it acts, so it causes a reduction in the blood pressure. So blood pressure regulation is a negative feedback mechanism. So apart from this, we have other examples for negative feedback mechanism. One is blood glucose regulation. Another one is endocrine hormone regulation. Okay, so there's an increase in T3, T4, there'll be a decrease in the thyroid stimulating hormone. So these are other examples of negative feedback mechanism. So we've seen about negative feedback mechanism, right? Here we go. So in homeostasis, there is an increase in glucose. So insulin is activated or increased, which lowers the glucose. BP is increased, baroreceptors are activated, decrease in blood pressure. So we saw about the control systems, right? So in the control systems, we saw negative feedback, positive feedback, and feed forward control. So coming to the negative feedback, we saw an example. There's an increase in blood pressure, which is the stimuli, sensory receptors, baroreceptors, and then there's effectors, which is the medulla of the brain. Together, this lowers the blood pressure. So the other examples of negative feedback that we saw was blood glucose regulation and in endocrine hormone regulation. For example, we saw an increase in the T3 and T4 levels, which leads to a decrease in the thyroid stimulating hormone levels. Okay, so next we'll see about positive feedback. Okay, positive feedback. So this has a lot of examples. So the main thing about positive feedback and the main difference between negative and positive feedback is that when there is an increase in the stimulus, in case of negative feedback, there will be a decrease in the response. But that is the opposite in case of positive feedback. There's an increase in stimulus, but then that also leads to an increase in the response. Okay, there's an increase in stimulus, there is an increase in the response. So we'll see the examples one by one. First one is blood clotting. Okay, so when blood clotting happens, the coagulation cascade. Okay, the coagulation cascade is amplified, right? So in blood clotting, the coagulation cascade is amplified. So there's a stimulus, there's an increase in the stimulus, which leads to an increased response. We'll go to our second example. LH surge, luteinizing hormone surge, which commonly occurs around ovulation, right? So LH surge occurs around ovulation, and this will lead to an increase in estrogen. There's an increase in estrogen, which again leads to an increase in LH. All these together leads to ovulation, right? There's an LH surge, there's increased estrogen, which further leads to increase in the luteinizing hormone, which finally leads to ovulation. Coming to the third example, action potential. So coming to action potential, in depolarization, when there is an increase in the sodium influx, it leads to further increase in sodium influx. That's it, right? In depolarization, when there's sodium influx, it further increases sodium influx. Coming to the fourth example. Okay, fourth example is shock, right? Hypovolemic shock. Okay, in hypovolemic shock, there is a decrease in the blood flow, right? Which further leads to a decrease in the perfusion to the heart, which leads to weakening of the heart, further leading to worsening of the shock. So the difference between the previous examples and this one is that all the others were an increase in stimulus, which led to an increase in the response. Here there is a decrease in stimulus, which leads to a decrease in the response. So hypovolemic shock, again there's a stimuli, but then there's decreased blood flow that led to a decreased perfusion to the heart, which led to worsening of the shock. So finally we'll see one example. Fifth one is parturition, childbirth. So here there is a increase in uterine contraction. Okay, increase in uterine contraction leads to dilatation of cervix. This causes increase in afferents and increase in oxytocin, together causing an increase in the uterine contraction. So together, there's an increased uterine contraction leading to dilatation of the cervix. So there's an increased oxytocin and afferents, which leads to further increase in uterine contraction. So this is termed as the Ferguson reflex. The Ferguson reflex, which leads to delivery of the fetus. Okay, so we've seen about positive feedback as well. The third one, feed forward control. Okay, feed forward control. The main difference between the other two control systems and the feed forward control is that an absence of stimulus. Okay, the other two examples we had, the other two systems we had a stimuli, but here there's no stimuli, but the system will anticipate a change. Okay, and so it will lead to correction. There'll be no stimulus, but the system will anticipate a change leading to correction. So for this also we'll be seeing examples. So the first example for feed forward control is body temperature regulation. Okay, body temperature regulation. So when there is a cold surrounding, okay, cold surrounding, this will lead to a decrease in the skin temperature. This will lead to a decrease in the skin temperature. But before this happens, before the stimuli happens, before the stimulus, only the skin temperature has reduced. But then the core temperature, the system anticipates a decrease in the core temperature, which hasn't occurred yet, but the system will anticipate a decrease in the core temperature, and thereby correction. It brings about correction, which is the shivering. Okay, so this is brought about by the hypothalamus. So body temperature regulation, there is decrease in skin temperature, but an anticipatory correction for a decrease in core temperature. Second one, we'll see another example for feed forward control. Thinking of doing exercise. So when someone thinks of doing exercise, there's an increase in the heart rate, which is called anticipatory tachycardia. Okay, There's an anticipatory tachycardia as well as an anticipatory tachypnea, an increase in the respiratory rate. Anticipatory tachypnea. Okay, when someone is thinking of doing exercise before the stimulus occurs. Okay, so third example is the role of cerebellum in motor coordination. The role of cerebellum in motor coordination. For example, when a driver is braking before a collision has occurred to avoid a collision. Anticipatory. So, before the stimulus has occurred, before the collision, a driver is braking. So, this is the role of cerebellum in the motor coordination. So, this is about homeostasis. Thank you.